Joining us now, our regular international affairs and security expert, James Brown. James Brown, great to see you. I want to start this morning, though, in Hong Kong. They're marking an important milestone over those democracy protests. Is there any sign of some resolution, some rapprochement on that issue?
Not yet, Kieran. I mean, it shows that this protest movement is continuing. It hasn't lost any steam. 1 million protesters on the streets of Hong Kong by the organisers' assessment, 183,000 by the Hong Kong police assessment, but a significant number in any regard, and a very peaceful protest. I think it's good to see that those protests are getting back to being more orderly. There was some damage done to one of the Hong Kong courts, an arson attack on that, but otherwise this was a protest largely without any violent incidents. But we're not seeing any change in the Beijing government's policies. We're not seeing any back down by Carrie Lam or her administration, and we're not seeing any significant concessions on those 5 demands that the protesters want at this stage.
That's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because we all thought, when no side moving, that it would result in a conflict. Is there a chance that these protests could just peter out over a long period of time?
Well, there's always that chance, but I mean, it's been 5 years since the Umbrella Revolution. It's been 6 months of the most recent batch of protests that we've seen in Hong Kong. So the will is still there. On the Chinese side, there's a lot happening outside the field of view of the protests. So I think China has been starting to try and mobilise more voices in Hong Kong arguing against the protests. We saw some newspaper advertisements taken out by a number of prominent Hong Kong Chinese businessmen arguing about the impact on the city's economy. We've seen some more strident rhetoric from the Chinese Communist Party about the role they believe foreign actors are playing in these protests, really trying to make the case that these are not legitimate democratic protests. And yesterday we had the quite interesting argument from the Hong Kong government saying, well, the fact that these protests are happening shows just how democratic Hong Kong actually is, so there's no need to be concerned about erosion of the one country, two systems establishment.
China is in the frame when it comes to the US defence outlook. We've known this for a long time, but interesting comments from Mark Esper, the Defence Secretary, that regardless of the distractions in the Middle East, China is the main game.
Yeah, we saw the Reagan National Defence Forum held over the weekend. It's a major convention for particularly Republican defence figures, but it has quite a bipartisan flavour, and it sets the agenda for the US defence and strategic debate. Mark Esper really going to great lengths to point out that he's committed to the national defence strategy that the US has established that prioritises China and Russia as strategic competitors. He made a lot of points about just how much they're struggling to meet readiness in the military because the US Congress has yet to provide an established budget for the US Defence Force. They're still working on a continuing resolution year to year, which means that they're actually losing money, and he was at pains to point out how that's having an impact across the US military establishment. But he said despite what's going on in the Middle East, despite the tensions with Iran that you were pointing to earlier, they have to keep focused on China and Russia, who increasingly are working together to frustrate US interests and those of US allies.
And if we stay on the United States, the impeachment inquiry is kicking along. It doesn't seem like it's taking any toll on President Trump, though.
Not yet. There's some suggestion that we'll see the articles in the next couple of days and that we could even move to begin that process of voting through the Judiciary Committee and then through the House as early as this week. There's a few things that are bubbling away in the background. Rudy Giuliani's role in all of this is a bit of a moving target. He's still engaged with the Ukraine. He's still being investigated, or certainly his associates are being investigated by the US Justice Department out of New York. That's one to watch, and there's been a lot of activity in the courts on some of the administration figures that have not been willing to testify. Don McGahn, the former White House counsel, and there's a question of whether some of those decisions could end up forcing people like John Bolton to give testimony during the impeachment hearings or trial. That's one to watch too.
And more broadly, what's your sense of how this plays out for Trump? Because the Republican lack of support for any impeachment is important because it's not going to eventuate. The optics on the Democratic side, it reinforces their view, but for the base, it does nothing to diminish his very strong support.
No, and he's making the argument that we're starting to see this being described as a fast and furious impeachment process by the Republicans, pointing out that the Democrats just want to get the president smeared. They're impeaching him because they hate him, not because he's done the wrong thing by the country, and they will continue to build that narrative. How the president structures his defence in any impeachment trial will be interesting, whether he plays at all. Whether Mitch McConnell allows the full process of the trial to play out and how he influences that process, whether he just cuts debate and ends it very suddenly. He has a significant degree of power in how any trial in the Senate plays out. So there are a lot of things that the Republicans could do to frustrate the Democrat impeachment process.
James Brown, thank you.